usually, this is a very misunderstood story. We frequently think of deserts being lost, grumbling, complaining, rebelling against God. And while that is true of that experience, that is the wrong picture. And it's the wrong purpose for the wilderness experience from God's vantage point. You see, from God's perspective, it was a time of nation forming and relation building. And when you think about it, what better place for something like that than the uncluttered desert, free from other distractions? And therefore, properly understood, we too should be, as the title of the Drash reminds us, wild about the wilderness, because God was. You see, it's a matter of adjusting our perspective, and a proper perspective is, after all, absolutely vital. Several weeks ago, a woman went to a doctor's office where she was seen by the young new doctor. After about 4 minutes in the examination room, the doctor told her she was pregnant. At this news, she burst out of the room, screaming loudly as she ran down the hall. Now, an older doctor heard the commotion, stopped her and asked her what the problem was, and she told him her story. After listening, he had her sit down and relax in another room. The older doctor then marched down the hallway to the back where the first doctor was, and he demanded, "What's the matter with you, Dr. Smith? Mrs. Terry is 59 years old. She has 4 grown children and 7 grandchildren. And you told her she was pregnant?" The new doctor continued to write on his clipboard, and without looking up, Dr. Smith simply said, "Does she still have the hiccups?" It truly is a matter of perspective. So let's examine the Midbar from a new perspective. Now, the book of Numbers, which we started reading a couple of weeks ago, begins by specifying that God spoke with Moses, B'midbar be'Ohel HaMoed, in the wilderness of Sinai, in the tent of meeting. Now, that raises a question. Would it not have been sufficient to simply say that God spoke with Moses in the tent of meeting? Why add in the wilderness of Sinai? Now, the Midrash, the ancient collection of texts where the rabbis reflect and expand on the biblical text, the Midrash offers a further explanation. It interprets this verse as indicating the character of God's interaction with Israel on their journey from Egypt to what eventually was known as Israel. And so it notes, according to the custom of the world, a king of flesh and blood who goes out to the desert, does he find there ease and security just as he would have found in the palace, the same food or drink? And you, who were slaves to Egypt, I brought you out of there, and I caused you to rest on princely couches, just as it is said, and then Exodus 13:18 is quoted, and God led the people by way of the wilderness. Now, what does "and God led" via save mean? The Midrash asks. It means that God caused them to rest according to the manner of the kings resting on their beds in the wilderness. And then it expands it a bit further, the thought. And the Midrash goes on to tell us that God provided for Israel in the wilderness in a way that they could experience life as if they were residents of a royal palace. He caused them to rest according to the manner of kings resting on their beds, is the text. Amazing. So how did God provide in this fashion for our ancestors in the desert? Well, the Midrash goes on to tell us, or to remind us, that we received manna, and so we didn't have to struggle for food in the wilderness. Furthermore, God surrounded Israel, as our rabbis of old remark, building on the text we have for tonight, with what are called the clouds of glory. Midrash points out these clouds shielded Israel from the sun and prepared the path for them in the wilderness, removing any obstacles from their way. Moreover, God provided water for Israel to drink in the form of a well or a rock, which would accompany them on their journeys. Let me pause in the Midrashic explanation here for a second. There's another Midrash on this that the ancient Rabbi, Rav Shaul, speaks about in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 4. Building on other Midrashic texts, connects this particular text with the Messiah. Anyhow, provided water for them in the form of a rock, which would accompany them on the journeys. And so this seemingly harmless, superfluous reference to God speaking with Moses, the Midbar, in the wilderness of Sinai, indicates midrashically that God provided for Israel in the wilderness better than even the finest royalty could have expected to receive. That's the midrashic understanding of this text. Now, understood in this light, we can then appreciate the following insight from our friends, the Hasidim, the ultra-Orthodox. Let me quote from one of their reflections. This is what Moshe gave to the Jews in the desert. Joy. It is the same joy that earlier enabled Abraham, our father, to pass all of God's tests, and is therefore the essence of Judaism. Without joy, Judaism can become mere ritual, and the Torah become just one of many religious manuals. With it, talking about joy, the reflection goes on, both are warm and alive, as are we. The desolate desert brought our ancestors to humility, the main prerequisite for joy. They realized that they, like the desert, have nothing of their own. Egotists can never be truly happy. They always want more for themselves. But the main source of Jewish joy is, as it says, by the splitting of the sea. This is now Exodus 14 and 15. The Jews believed in God and his servant Moshe, and then they sang. End quote. It's the same for us in each and every one of our circumstances. When we believe in God, then we can sing. And so the joy of the Lord truly becomes our strength, as we read in the book of Nehemiah. Furthermore, the message of the book of Numbers yields another insight. You see, far from traveling and encamping through this wilderness trek in a haphazard, chaotic fashion, the Israelites are given a deliberate plan. Chapter 1, verse 50, text from a couple weeks ago. They will encamp around the Mishkan, the tabernacle. Now, additionally, that particular text, the Parashah there, describes the detailed positioning of the 12 tribes when it says, camped on the front or east side, the standard of the division of Judah. A little later, on the south, the standard of Reuven. A little further, on the west, the standard of the division of Ephraim. And then a little further on the north, the standard of the division of Dan. So, what can we learn from this meticulous order, and in particular, the focal point of the encampment? Foremost, above all else, is the shared focus of this particular plan. As the Mishkan, the tabernacle, housed God's presence among the Israelites, it's no surprise that all their eyes would be rooted on that, let's call it, sacred space. Much like in our Parashah for tonight, remember, Aaron was told to focus the lights of the menorah on the area in front of the menorah. Same kind of thing here. Such careful positioning offered the Israelites a tangible mission statement for their journey through the desert to the land of Israel. In essence, it was saying that they marched not only for themselves or for the community surrounding them, but more significantly, they marched as sacred witnesses to the actual and active presence of God among them. And this is what Balaam, that strange prophet, clearly recognized as well in the selection we started this evening with Matohu. And significantly, beginning the second chapter of Numbers, we are told the Israelites shall camp each with his standard under the banners of their ancestors.